Super Mario 64. This game was simply revolutionary. The game first released in Japan on June 23rd, 1996 as a launch title for the Nintendo 64 and immediately took the world by storm. Anyone watching this video probably already knows why Mario 64 is such an important game for the video game industry. It was the first game to truly feature fully open 3D environments that could be explored with no real limitations. It's the first successful attempt at making an actual 3D platforming game, which is impressive when you consider the fact that this game released in 1996, a year not very far from the early 90s where 2D video games dominated the industry. But let's be real, we're living in the year 2020. Super Mario 64 released in 1996, a whopping 24 years ago. There are so many 3D games in existence right now that it's easy to take an old game like Mario 64 for granted. So to fully understand what makes Mario 64 so important, even today, let's take a step back to the 1980s when home console video gaming was still very young. One of the earliest attempts at making a 3D game with 2D graphics was an arcade game named Congo Bongo. I actually didn't even know this game existed before I did the research for this video. This game was released in 1983 and was developed and published by, Sega of all companies. That's ironic. In this game, the player takes the role of a safari hunter who tries to catch an ape named Bongo. The levels are viewed in an isometric perspective and you have to move and jump to avoid enemies and obstacles to complete a level. You see, the thing is that this game wasn't actually three-dimensional, it was isometrical. A true 3D game is something more akin to real life where you can move around freely in any direction you so desire, while actually being able to see directly in front of you. With a game like Congo Bongo, you're limited to only moving in 4 directions and you can only see whatever's on screen at any given time. You can't actually look directly ahead or around you. Now, there were some other isometrical games released in the 80s, such as Night Lore, Fairlight, and Glider Rider, but these games had the same limitations that Congo Bongo had. You could only move in 4 directions and the screen was seen from an isometric viewpoint, so everything in a particular area in these games had to be on screen all at once. This is limiting because an actual 3D game will let you freely move around and let you see what's coming ahead of you as opposed to only being able to see the obstacles on one screen at a time. Congo Bongo wasn't the only game released in 1983 that attempted, well, I guess you could call it semi-3D gameplay. There was another game that was developed by Konami and released in 1983 for the MSA. It's called Antarctic Adventure. This game has you controlling a penguin in a forward-scrolling third-person perspective while having to jump over pits and obstacles. Now, this game technically is a step in the right direction because you can actually see ahead of you. But this game is also limited in its own way because you can only move left to right and there's a limit to how far right and left you can actually go. It's also super linear and doesn't let you do anything besides jumping to avoid obstacles. Fun fact though, there was actually a sequel to this game named Penguin Adventure that Hideo Kojima actually helped design. That's the same guy behind the Metal Gear series. Now how you go from making a game like this to a game like this is beyond me. The next example of an attempt at a 3D video game was the 3D Battles of World Runner, developed by Square and released on the NES in 1987. Now this game was actually quite a big step forward actually. 3D World Runner was a forward-scrolling pseudo 3D third-person platform action game where players are free to move in any forward-scrolling direction and had to leap over obstacles and chasms. This was one of the first ever stereoscopic 3D games, and it's kind of cool how much stuff is actually happening on screen at once. Now while this is definitely impressive for its time, it's easy to see the limitations of it. You're moving forward automatically with no direct control of the character, and you can still only move left and right. And while you can see ahead of you and there's platforming, it's still just a flat area where you avoid whatever obstacles show up in front of you at a given time. I have to give credit where it's due though. This game was definitely a step in the right direction and it came out as early as 1987, which is certainly impressive. Another fun fact here, some of the people who worked on 3D Battles of World Runner will later rise to fame as core members of the team behind the popular Final Fantasy role-playing video game series. That's pretty neat. There are countless examples of games in the early 90s that attempted to do 3-dimensional gameplay. There was Pilot Wings, which was a flight simulation game that utilized the SNES's Mode 7 capability, which mimics 3D graphics by rotating and scaling flat objects. There was Star Fox, which was a 3D on-rails shooter game. This game was notable for being Nintendo's first ever fully polygonal 3D game. There was a game called Geograph Seal, which was a first-person mecha platform shooter game, released for the Japan-exclusive Sharp X68000 in 1994. And there was a game called Fade to Black, an action-adventure game released for the Microsoft DOS in 1995. Those are just a few examples. Now the games that I just listed are cool and all, but they all have one thing in common: they're not 3D platformers. Platforming wasn't the focus of these games, so the feeling of exploring an actual world was rather limited overall. So let's talk about some of the actual 3D platformers that released before Super Mario 64. Believe it or not, the first ever true 3D platforming game was a French computer game called Alpha Waves, developed by Infogrames and released for the Atari ST in 1990. And I have to say, I'm quite surprised. This was another game I didn't know existed before doing the research for this video. I mean, sure, it definitely looks archaic by today's standards, but this is a straight up full-on 3D platformer that was released way back in 1990. This game definitely isn't winning any awards or anything. As you can see, it's just a bunch of polygons and it honestly looks more like a tech demo than an actual completed game. But despite this is definitely still a milestone in gaming history. This is objectively the first 3D platformer, and it was released a whopping 6 years before Super Mario 64 would eventually topple it. This is a very interesting little piece of gaming history right here. Bug was a Sega Saturn game that was released in 1995, and it offered a more conservative approach to true 3D platforming. While the game was 3D and you could jump on enemies, collect stuff, and do some platforming, it was still limited in the fact that you can only move in 4 directions, and the levels were designed in a way that made it so you can't actually explore. You pretty much just have to follow these thin paths that the game has laid out for you. There's no true 3-dimensional exploration here whatsoever. Jumping Flash was released on the PlayStation in 1995, developed by Exact, the same company that made Geograph Seal back in 1994, the game I mentioned earlier. Jumping Flash holds the record for being the first platform video game in true 3D, according to Guinness World Records. Well, haha, in your face, Guinness World Records people. Alpha Waves was the first true 3D platformer, not Jumping Flash. Clearly those guys over at Guinness didn't do their Wikipedia research like me. Okay, in all seriousness though, this was still a pretty big deal. This game was a legitimate 3D platformer released before Super Mario 64. You can move freely, you can jump around, you can still shoot enemies like in Geograph Seal, but this game was still a platformer more than anything else. Heck, the only real downsides to it is that it was a first-person game. We still had yet to have a true 3D platformer where you can actually see the character you're controlling. Jumping Flash is also still quite linear at times, which I feel was a common problem with games that attempted 3D in this era. But hey, a game called Floating Runner came out for the PlayStation in early 1996. This is a neat game because it's a 3D platform where you can actually see the character you're controlling, unlike Jumping Flash, and the graphics are pretty impressive as well. This is a very nice game that definitely deserves some recognition, but you can't actually see in front of you. The game is viewed from a more top-down perspective. The levels are also quite small and compact, so the feeling of exploration isn't really there. As you can see, there were plenty of 3D games before the release of Super Mario 64, games that tried to break the mold and free the industry from the constriction of 2-dimensional video games. Any game that attempted to do 3D always stood out at the time, because there was a huge contrast to the majority of games that people were used to in the 80s and 90s. But nothing would stand out quite as much as one single Nintendo 64 game would. That game was Super Mario 64. I mean, honestly, just look at this game and compare it to all the games that I just talked about. It's easy to tell from the start that Mario 64 was not just another failed attempt at making a true 3D platforming game. No, this was far more than just an attempt. This was an actual full 3D platformer. After the release of Mario 64, this game set a completely new standard for what a video game can actually be. Developers could no longer go back to making games the way they used to, and as a result, many developers simply mimicked what Super Mario 64 did. Now, my personal history with Mario 64 is actually quite negative. I didn't grow up with this game like a lot of people did. Super Mario Sunshine was actually my first 3D Mario game, and I wouldn't go on to play Mario 64 until 2006 when it released on the Wii Virtual Console. I remember my first time playing Mario 64 being well, not so pleasant experience. You see, since I grew up in the era of GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, I was used to games with significantly better graphics than that of Nintendo 64 games. The blocky, pixelated graphics of Mario 64 compared to later games in the series was just so daunting to me. I thought that the graphics were so ugly that it was hard for me to even take the game seriously. Like geez, I still remember seeing Bowser for the first time in Mario 64. Seeing how blocky Bowser was got a huge laugh out of me as a kid. When I was younger, I didn't really play a whole lot of classic games outside of the Genesis Sonic the Hedgehog games that were re-released as Sonic Mega Collection for the GameCube. But the thing about those games is that they were 16-bit games, which in my opinion have aged much better than the blocky, pixelated graphics of 32-bit and 64-bit games. You know, despite my early experiences with Mario 64 being bad, I've come to appreciate the game a lot more over the years. It was hard for me to accept Mario 64 at first because I was exposed to so many games that had better graphics and more solid gameplay. But the thing you have to keep in mind is that these games that have better visuals and gameplay than Mario 64 wouldn't even exist without Mario 64. You just have to revert your brain back to the days of 1996 to fully understand why Mario 64 is such an important and influential video game. And honestly, even without the notion that Mario 64 is a revolutionary game for the industry, it's just a solid game in general. The courses in this game were very well designed for the most part. This game has so many worlds to explore, lots of fun platforming challenges, cool new power-ups, a variety of boss fights, super fun controls, a cool and interesting hub world, the list goes on and on. This game definitely wouldn't have had the impact that it did if it wasn't also just a good game in its own right. In fact, there are people out there who still view Mario 64 as the best Mario game and one of the greatest games of all time, even to this day. While I don't agree, and I personally think there are many better games out there nowadays, especially in the Mario franchise, I could honestly see how some people think this is the greatest, especially if they grew up with the game. I mean, honestly, I feel like Mario 64 is better than a lot of the games that release in today's industry anyway. At the end of the day though, even though there are many 3D games out there now that overshadow Mario 64, there's a reason why Super Mario 64 is one of the most well-renowned and talked about games of all time. It's not because Super Mario 64 was the first 3D video game, far from it actually. It's because Super Mario 64 set a completely new standard for video games as a whole, not even just platformers. So many developers attempted to break into the world of 3D gaming as far back as the 80s, but there was always some kind of limitation in those games that stopped them from leaving a real impact. Super Mario 64 opened up so many possibilities for not only the Mario franchise, but the video game industry as a whole. And I think this old commercial for Mario 64 describes it perfectly.
Listen up. We will not live in a two-dimensional world.
We won't go in one direction
or zig where we can zag.
We will walk through walls.
We will take a look around us.
We will not be confined.
We believe in the path of least limits.
We won't be told how to view the world.
We will experience true freedom.
We will not compromise. We will live the game through our hands.
We will be in control of something.
We will change the system.
So to any of you young folks out there who may look back on Super Mario 64 as an overrated and dated game from the 90s, just remember that Mario 64 was pretty much one of the best games you could play back in 1996. And there will never be any other game that will impact the gaming industry as much as Super Mario 64 did. Thanks for watching.